This week on Engage the Sage.
Hi everyone, I'm Don Saucier. Welcome to this week's episode of Engage the Sage. This week, I'm going to talk to you about how using your student stories in class can help you teach. I love stories. I love to tell stories. I love to listen to stories. They catch my attention, they're captivating, and often in class, they're a great way to show the content. If you've been a student in my class, you've heard lots and lots of my stories, and the only thing I like better than my own stories are the stories I hear from my students. I'm going to start out by telling you a couple stories that my students have told me that are some of my favorites, and I continue to share them in my classes. One story, and it's not even so much a story as a comment, I can picture what the story would be like, is I was talking about masculine honor ideology in my advanced social psychology class. And this is a belief system that basically says that men in particular at times might feel it's necessary to use violence and aggression to protect themselves, their reputations, and the people around them. So as I was teaching about this construct, one of my students, a student named Maggie, said, "That sounds like my grandpa." I explored, "What do you mean by that sounds like your grandpa?" And she proceeded to tell me this wonderful story. I don't even remember all the details because I was just in such disbelief over how her grandfather on repeated occasions would defend himself and the people around him against a host of other people, including white supremacists, dirty cops, and all kinds of things. I left the story thinking that Maggie's grandfather needs at least a miniseries. Possibly my favorite, though, is I was teaching about helping, and in particular bystander effects and the things that keep people from giving help in a lot of situations where they see something going down. So in the context of this conversation, I was sharing stories of people doing really heroic things and overcoming all of these barriers to social intervention in a helping situation. One of my students, a student named Lena, said, "Sounds like my dad." A lot of the stories sounds like a family member. So I said, "What do you mean this sounds like your dad?" And she said, "He does this stuff all the time." Lena then proceeded to share a number of examples, not just one, but a number of examples of her dad being this absolute superhero and saving people from awful harm. One of the stories was that he was at a 7-Eleven, and there was a gas station outside of the 7-Eleven. He saved a woman from a kidnapper, actually got her out of a van where she was screaming for help, brought her into the 7-Eleven, barred the door so the kidnapper couldn't come in, and called the police to help her. What was probably most amazing about this story, though, is that my student Lena didn't hear about it because he didn't talk about it when he got home. She heard about it much later from her mother. Lena's dad also, on the day that he and Lena's mom got married, were driving, I think, to the reception. He was dressed in his tux. He was all ready to go when he saw a car go off the road into a swamp. Lena's dad, seeing this car go off the road and into the swamp and start to submerge, stopped his own car and in his tuxedo dove into the swamp, alligators and all, to save this person. In his frantic search for this person underwater, he lost his wallet, his pager, and his car keys as he was driving to his wedding reception to try to save this stranger who had driven off the road. The stranger was fine. Actually, the stranger swam away and didn't realize Lena's dad was in the water looking for them. But this is an amazing display of someone overcoming all of the social barriers that often prevent us from helping in these kinds of situations and provided an amazing example of someone doing the right thing at the right time. Not only do I share these stories moving forward, and the students have given me permission to use their names in sharing this, or at least their first names, is in Lena's dad's instance, I even have a meme that we made in honor of him. I think my students sharing stories with me is a wonderful way for them to make connections in my content that I can then use to share with others to make similar connections in the content for them. One of the things I think we as instructors should do is set up classrooms where we build community and we build rapport so that our students will feel comfortable sharing these stories with us. One of the reasons I think that my students share stories in their class with me and I love hearing these stories is I let them know that I love hearing their stories and I provide them space and opportunity for them to share them. The easiest and most direct way that I let them share them is by using their actual voices in class. So when I'm going through and I'm discussing constructs, talking about theories, I'm giving examples, I provide opportunity if they would like to share their own examples. And I think having them do that is a great way for them to make sense of the content in personalized ways for themselves. Not everyone wants to talk in class though, so another way that I allow my students to share these stories with me is through weekly reflections. In many of my classes, I will have weekly assignments where my students will share with me examples of the theories, of the constructs we're working through, so that they can make the connections for themselves. And these provide additional stories that students might not want to say out loud in class that I can then go through and share in abbreviated versions in future classes. And by doing so, I can let those quieter students know, hey, I like what you're saying. Now, caveat here. If you're in a class like mine where you talk about issues of violence and aggression and those kinds of things, it is important to let your students know that you're a mandatory reporter. And if they're going to share stories that warrant you making that report, that's going to be something that you must do. So letting them know that ahead of time, I think, is really important. I love my students to share stories. When they're sharing the story, there's some things that I try to make sure that I'm doing. And the first of those is I try to make sure that I'm doing and demonstrating good active listening. When the student gets done their story, I'm going to validate them. I'm going to thank them, and I'm going to mean it for sharing their story. I'm going to thank them for trusting me in the class, for hearing about their experience. While they're talking, I'm going to give them my eyes and my shoulders. So I'm actually going to turn toward the student. I'm going to nod. I'm going to smile. I'm going to give them nonverbal appreciation for them sharing their story. When the student is done sharing their story, I'm going to further demonstrate my active listening by giving a summary of the story and relating it directly to the constructs about which we're talking. So I'm going to make the connections for the rest of the class that the student has already made for themselves. And if those stories are great, I might even in the moment say, that is amazing. Can I share that? If the student says yes after the fact, I'll follow up and see if they're okay with me using their first name and sharing the story in future semesters or in videos like this. There are a few reasons where I really love this activity of having students share their stories. First, it's a great way to get to know my students. It's a great way for them to give me some glimpse of what it's like to be them, about the lives they lead, the families they have, the jobs they have. It's a great way for me to build community around that humanization of all of us in my class. Second, what this humanizing does is actually allows us to create both deeper connections among us as people in my class, but also deeper connections to the content. And when we make those deeper, more sophisticated connections to the content with these personalized examples, my students learn it better. Possibly my favorite part of people sharing stories in my class, though, is that when I invite students to share their stories, even if they're not the student who's actually talking and sharing, all of my students are invited to make these personalized connections to the information so that each of them, every single one of them, whether they talk or not or share or not, learns the material better. As I started this video by saying, storytelling is awesome. I love to tell stories and I love to hear my students' stories. And I find time and space in my classes for my students to do so. I think it not only creates a better learning environment, it not only helps us to get to know each other better as people, but it deepens our understanding and learning of the content. I love my students' stories, and I bet if you allow your students to tell you their stories, you'll love them too. In the comments below, I would love to hear some of your favorite stories from your students, and also to talk about how you get your students to share wonderful stories in your classes. Thank you for watching this episode of Engage the Sage. Please like, subscribe, sign up for notifications, share us on social media, and we'll see you next time on Engage the Sage.